Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, it's time for another catalog in brief. While I did design this format primarily to talk about artists I wouldn't get the opportunity to look at otherwise, this isn't to say that all artists I've covered before in some form are completely off the table for this. In this particular case, we're talking about an artist who I not only once covered in a video before, but even already did an in brief segment on. Although, I came to later feel like that old video didn't really do him justice. In brief segments in the earlier days of my channel were a lot more focused on brevity over actually communicating my feelings, and in the extreme of how I used to handle those, when faced with a catalog as massive as this one, I opted not to even talk about all the albums. Just the popular ones, which added up to maybe a little over half of his main album catalog. Since then, I've covered catalogs that are just as imposing, if not even more imposing than his, and in even more actual detail. Once my videos on Klaus Schulze and Ryuichi Sakamoto came and went, all bets were off. Leaving the lack of detail in that one old video to stand out to me more and more as something I really should have been able to do a lot better. Unfortunately for me, the album I did that old video on also marked the point at which the artist in question went from being one of the most prolific popular artists in electronic music, dropping albums all over the place like it was nobody's business, to going near completely quiet for almost a full decade at this point. The album I did that video on was back in 2018, and he has barely released anything at all since then, let alone a new solo album. Technically, there was like an EP under the name Speed Dealer Moms, a collaboration with John Frusciante, but that's like 2 tracks, so I thought, fuck it, now that I'm doing this format of just, like, going through catalogs, that's a good enough excuse to actually talk about this guy in a way where I can actually articulate myself and I'm not just skipping over half the albums out and not having the stomach for it yet. So here we are. Today we're talking about Aaron Funk, aka Venetian Snares. One of the most famous IDM artists outside of that exclusive Warp Records club, and often credited as the artist who first really popularized breakcore as a genre, and one of the most notable overabusers of the amen break. He obviously did not invent jungle break beats. There was at least a whole decade of tradition that came before which he was building off of. But he was on a very particular scene that started in the late 90s and early 2000s that liked really abusing those breaks and cramming in as many crazy edits of them as possible with even higher tempos and stuff. I wouldn't be able to fully tell you what makes something specifically breakcore and not just jungle or drum and bass. I think it might be a matter of sheer tempo or something about the presentation of it. I think there's more like gabber kicks and stuff, possibly. I don't know. But obviously don't quote me on that. I mean, point is, Venetian Snares likes amen breaks. You probably already know who he is if your taste happens to mirror mine in any significant way. Albums like Rossz, Czillag, Alatt, Született, Huge Chrome Cylinder Box Unfolding, the Chocolate Wheelchair album, Winter in the Belly of a Snake, and others are considered all-time classics of the entire genre, and are already widely circulated among fans of the likes of Aphex Twin and Outtaker, who want to go exactly one step deeper than the surface level and enter into that tier that artists like Mike Paradinas, Luke Vibert, and Bogdan Rosinsky occupy. Now, my reasoning for skipping over nearly half the Venetian Snares catalog in my old video wasn't just because of his sheer volume of output, with nearly 30 albums total if you include collabs, and a couple of side aliases, but skip over EPs and mini-albums, which might even double the amount of output. I mean, the volume of output was a big reason for my hesitance at the time, but I was also particularly put off by the general juvenile edgelordy attitude and subject matter this guy very frequently presents his work with, which makes, like, even Aphex Twin and Square Pusher's naughtiest impulses look tame by comparison. Venetian Snares was an artist who loved hitting the shock value button back in the old days, not just through all the cursing and fucks and occasional outdated homophobic humor, but sometimes through intentionally ugly packaging, loads of explicit sexual imagery, in one case making an album loosely centered around the theme of murdering children. And we're not even touching his mini-album called Horse and Goat. I know saying don't Google it is a surefire way to make people Google it, but don't Google it. From all I can tell, the guy seems to be a perfectly nice, chill dude in real life, but boy howdy can some of his stuff get on the distasteful side. Now, mind you, in most cases the packaging and presentation of his music is a lot more off-putting than the music itself. Guy, again, he loved cramming amen end breaks and everything, and there were plenty of more extreme and noisy moments in his catalog, but his work was far from inaccessible on average. And for every album with shock value packaging, there was another completely harmless one like traditional synthesizer music or something. Guy had some problematic tendencies, but this particular genre could do a lot worse. Whatever mood happened to strike the guy in a given moment, whether that be mundane, depressed, happy, angry, or wanting to push people away, that would be what his album would sound like. I read in an old interview where he mentioned there was lots of material he abandoned because it only represented a feeling he had in a brief moment that faded, and he didn't come back to it because that same feeling didn't strike him again and it didn't feel real to him anymore. This was presumably the attitude that led him to put out so much work at such a high speed and then eventually just stop, leaving me without a good opportunity to try talking about him again and doing it right this time. Ultimately, Venetian Snares is actually the kind of artist who felt like the perfect fit for this format. I wouldn't really want to do a full-on discography review on him, not just because he's got way too many albums and such a series would be way too much work lasting like at least a full year if not even longer, but also because I don't actually have a lot of detailed things to say about all those albums. One single big in brief video feels like the best way to tackle his stuff. It had also obviously been years since I'd given his stuff a chance. I feel like I'm a fair bit more open-minded to the more extreme and noisy sides of this genre than I used to be, so I'm not just going to skip over the stuff that doesn't look like it would appeal to me. And seeing his album Traditional Synthesizer Music just get a 10-year anniversary reissue inspired me to go through with making this, so here we go. I'm talking about the Venetian Snares album discography. I skipped over mini albums and EPs because once again there's just too many, but I did include his collaborations with other artists, at least the ones where Venetian Snares was a co-lead artist. I skipped his collaborations under other band names such as Speed Dealer Moms with John Frusciante, among others, although he did also have one side alias used for his regular solo work called Last Step that he used a couple of times, so I decided to include at least those in this rundown. So there you go, those will be some more structured rules to put into place that can keep this video digestible enough without relying on pure vibes of what I want to talk about. Even if I guess that would also technically fit for this guy's typical MO. Obviously not everyone has my taste, so there is utility in looking at stuff that may not appeal to me personally in case it can work for other people. Anyway, I think that's more than enough prelude, so here's my quick thoughts on his discography so far. Alright, so we're starting with a project which was technically originally released as an EP on cassette in 1999, though got reissued 20 years later as his canonical debut album in 2019, with a couple of tracks from other random EPs and mini-albums he self-released on cassettes, added onto the original track listing to make the experience more album-like. Said 2019 version is obviously the version I heard. Anyway, this is pretty much just 40 straight minutes of gabber kicks and distorted breaks, nothing but going hard with percussion with a few shouted samples here and there. Perhaps the kind of thing you might not expect to be my thing based on how I've talked about this kind of music before, but I do generally find it to be a fun time. I do like how unpredictably the grooves wind around, guys out here going fuck time signatures and letting the beats just zigzag around ad nauseum. Really my biggest problem is that it's just kind of one note and gets a little monotonous by the end. Ironically works better in its original form as an EP than extended out to an album. Next up, here's a split tape he did with Stunt Rock. This is more stuff like the last record, although going out of its way to be even more edgy and distasteful. From starting with a track that has the sound of someone pissing, transitioning into distorted screams, to a track called Gay that not only has the LOL gay audio snippets, but also features him chopping up MLK's I Have a Dream speech to make it sound like he's dreaming of crooked little children. I mean, I spent much of my adolescence in the YTP community, so I'm more than familiar with this offensive-on-purpose style of humor, though I never found it all that funny even back then, and is just poorly aged and eye-roll-inducing now. The rest of the tape's fine, but I can't imagine I'll be coming back to it. If you're curious on my thoughts on the Stunt Rock side of this tape, which I literally only just heard from an unofficial YouTube upload last night and decided to edit in this quick bit on, like, extremely last minute, That side is blunter and noisier, maybe even a bit more intentionally tasteless, though my thoughts on both sides of the tape aren't that fundamentally different. You could have told me this was all one artist and I would have believed it. And as for actual enjoyment, all I can say is this kind of thing will be for somebody, and that somebody is not me. More stuff like the last two records, but it's a proper full-length album, so there's about twice as much of it. I mean, it does have its moments. The opener Salt is a strong start with some cool inclusions of vocal samples, and I found the chopped up choirs and video game sound effects on Cruel Hole to particularly stand out to me. And everything else still bangs as much as always, though most of this just kind of went in one ear and out the other and ran together in a blur of breaks and squealing synth effects, even on multiple run-throughs. And the experience adds up to nearly an hour and a half total, a length I was definitely feeling by the end. Like, what if Aphex Twins Drux, but every track just sounds like Cockver 10? There is some good stuff here, and nothing too edgy or problematic, but I'm not gonna call it a must-listen either. At least this album he did with Speedranch doesn't sound exactly like his last several projects. Although, it is also just a straight harsh noise record. I mean, at least the experience doesn't run together like the last one. It's got everything from screaming the words unborn baby over and over, to intense high-pitched squealing that somehow makes Ventolin look like Alberto Balsam by comparison, to deep-frying popular songs like Stairway to Heaven, to people making sex noises, and more. And there is not a single sound that isn't bricked out and distorted to the absolute maximum level. I mean, it probably will not surprise anyone to hear that I did not particularly enjoy this. The only bit of this designed to appeal to me was like a 5-second break in one track that sampled Bon Jovi's Given Love a Bad Name and thereby reminded me of Orbital. The rest of it, I can theoretically see the appeal for other people. If you're a big harsh noise person, it'll probably be worth giving a shot. I know I saw at least one guy on Discogs who marked this as his best work by far, purely on the merits of being his most brutal, but yeah, for me, I think one listen was enough, and I think it's safe to assume I'm not coming back to it again. Okay, now this marks the point at which he got signed to Planet Mew and started to gain a fair bit more notoriety. This was also what I chose as my starting point to get into him back in 2018. It's also quite handily the best project he'd released up to this point. It pretty much carries off the same style as what he was doing on his own before, all the same crazy breakbeat mashups that were all over Greg Hates Car Culture and Shiver in Eternal Darkness. But there's some more actual variety brought to the table through the melodies on top. They don't actually form any coherent tunes and are just as dissonant and chaotic as the beats, but they provide some extra textures to ensure the tracks don't all sound functionally identical. There's tracks with meowing sound effects or announcing I am a cat. There was one track that had a trumpet on it. There's interludes that sound like they're playing random piano notes. I wouldn't be surprised if they were like drawings of cats converted to MIDI. There's also the whole supposed gimmicks of tracks like having spectrograms of pictures of his cats too. It's just an all-around lighthearted and goofy fun time that also happens to go hard as shit. Next, on the complete opposite end of the tonal spectrum is the third album he came out with in 2001. Yes, that's all of these from the same year. This time he released on Hyman Records and centered around the topic of child murder. There's tracks here called Befriended Child Killer, Pressure Torture, and All the Children Are Dead. Off the promise of the subject matter, I had originally skipped over this one entirely in my initial half-marathon of his catalog. Knowing how this guy frequently operates, especially in this era, I had been half expecting this to be some kind of, like, overly edgy and distasteful joke like LOL Dead Kids, the album. Although coming back to actually listen to it, I enjoyed myself a fair bit more than I thought I would, because there's no jokes here. What it is pure horror movie vibes. It's evoking shit like the movies Seven or The Exorcist. This shit sounds like really evil and menacing, with lots of pitch-down movie dialogue and aggressively heavy dark ambience sharing time with the usual crazy breakbeat workouts. Guy's brought in more industrial influence than he ever had before, and I could appreciate that. Now granted, I could have possibly gotten into this even more if not for the fact that I also had just recently got into this other album that goes for almost the exact same sound, and not only does it better in my opinion, but is way more subtle about it without all the shock value. That being Christophe de Babylon's If You're Into It, I'm Out of It. But hey, even if this is not as good for me as that album, it is still very good for what it is. Decently well varied, well constructed, tight and to the point, not much to complain about. Maybe not one of my favorites, I don't even think it's like a keeper, but I thought it was good. If you told me this was your favorite, I could see it. Alright, now this one's got a whole bunch of different stuff going on. There's plenty of tracks here that just play the usual jungle breakbeat formula straight, but it also starts with a track shredding opera samples into a million pieces. There's a track, Banana Seat Girl, that chops up some funky jazz sample, which ends up as one of his most colorful and playful mixes ever. There's a noise piece called Fuck Off that actually hit a lot better than I remembered. There's a track combining the breaks with some mysterious dark ambience on Walmer's side. There's a whole melancholic ambient piece called Dismantling 5 Years, which actually feels kind of like Mike Paradinas' Bluff Limbo coded, and ends in a cut called We Are Oceans, combining the breaks with some somber string performances for a classical flavor. Dang, wouldn't it be cool if he did a whole album like that? This is obviously not one of his more cohesive records. There's no real through line to tie any of these ideas together, but I'm never going to complain about getting this much variety, and every individual track here hits well for whatever tone it is going for, so yeah, definitely worth hearing. This is an underrated entrant into his catalog. This feels like a random selection of stuff that didn't make the cut for his last handful of albums. I kinda like the 10-minute epic Twisting Ligneous and the way it randomly briefly turns into a dub track about halfway through. $2 is another round of funkiness in the vein of Banana Seat Girl, and I guess the dying jazz band approach on We Are Cesspools is neat too, though this is mostly just ideas you've heard him do better elsewhere. It's generally fun, but not essential. This album, meanwhile, feels like his most serious effort up to this point and a culmination of lots of different ideas he's explored previously, combining the usual rapid percussion workouts with darker ambience, some occasional classical influences with strings and stuff, a few creepier abstract noise influences, even 2 tracks he sings himself and provides an acceptable enough Bowie impression, with the opener being about his dead father. This album hits a good balance of having a longer, fleshed out track listing that neither feels too samey nor too scattered. It's cohesive and focused, but still varied enough to never be boring. There is also maybe a part of me who wished it elicited a stronger or more visceral reaction out of me than it did. Other albums have had much higher high points. But it is one of his most consistent and well-constructed as a complete whole. I get exactly why it's one of the most commonly highlighted picks for his best work overall. On the other end of the tonal spectrum, here's one of his most playful, lighthearted, and upbeat albums, bringing in more hip-hop influences than ever before, chopping up jazz samples and samples of rapping and dub reggae toasting to go up next to his usual crazy jungle breaks. I compared it to Square Pusher back in the day, probably because of the surface-level jazz breakbeat crossover parallel, though their approach to combining those styles really do not resemble each other beyond that surface level. Maybe this thing might be a slight bit on the front-loaded side, but I think I can also call this one great and one of his best. It never cracked into my regular listening rotation, but I would not be able to tell you why. I may just have to put it on more often. This one, okay. So this shows him leaning away from the jungle breaks and instead going much more in a traditional Warp Records metallic IDM direction and eliciting a lot of direct comparison to the kind of stuff Outtaker were doing around the time. And when I say direct, I mean extremely direct. It's a total dead ringer for like their Confield and LP5 eras, to the point of sounding more like their work than the work of Venetian Snares. Which, for a lot of people, is very much the primary appeal, and the exact reason people will cite for this being their favorite album of his overall. Certainly it is by some distance his most technically impressive sound design up to this point, with way cleaner sounding production than anything he'd done previously, or even most of the stuff he'd even do afterwards. Though personally, as easy as this album is to appreciate for its craft and production, it's still not really one of my favorites of his. I was really hoping to say this one grew on me, since I have gained more of an appreciation for the LP5 and Confield eras of Outtaker as I've gotten older. But the Venetian Snares take on that sound totally runs together for me. It almost feels like every track is trying to be Acro Year 2, which is all well and good since Acro Year 2 is a great track, but the non-stop metallic percussion workouts, as high detail as they are, eventually just get monotonous for me. Save for the ending, I do quite like the last two tracks, with a nice bit of dreamlike melodic ambience, and a solidly spacious and climactic feeling closer. But the rest of this thing, I mostly just hold at a distance without being as moved or excited by what I'm hearing as I want to be. I am well aware my take on this one is very much in the minority. It is obviously one of his most popular albums, and to be clear, I do not hate it by any stretch. At the very worst, it's like decent to pretty good. I just don't really see myself keeping it around for myself. If I'm looking for this vibe, I'm more likely to just want to listen to Outtaker, and if I'm in a Venetian Snares kind of mood, there's plenty of other albums that feel more like his own thing that I wouldn't be able to get elsewhere, so yeah. Anyway, here's an album he made as an endearing tribute to his hometown of Winnipeg, featuring such track titles as Winnipeg is a Dogshit Dildo and Die Winnipeg Die 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 Fuckers Die. You can really feel that kind of hometown pride over the whole record. Anyway, musically it's back to pure breakbeat workouts with lots more distorted gabber kicks. Basically more stuff in the vein of Greg Hates Car Culture, except if all the vocal samples mentioned Winnipeg in some form. It is definitely a Venetian Snares album that exemplifies the kind of sound I think of when I think of him in passing, and I will admit it was not quite as difficult to listen as I expected it would be back when I skipped over it for my first attempt at marathoning his catalog. I mean, if you want more bangers like that really early period stuff, check it out, but also like that early period stuff, I'm not going to call this like a major favorite either. It got a bit repetitive. It's just alright. Right, this one. This isn't his worst album cover ever, but it's up there. That is apparently an armpit mirrored to look more inappropriate than it already is, and I wouldn't blame anyone if they just skipped over it purely for not wanting to look at that cover. I very nearly did on my 2018 run-through. Though, if you can get past that, I feel like one could make a solid case for this one possibly being like his best or like your favorite. It's like a combination of nearly all the different sides to his sound at once. There's tracks with hardcore breaks sharing space with more traditional drum machines and overt electronic aesthetics. There's bits of experimental dark ambience, melodic samples, tracks with jazz influences or classical influences, sometimes lighthearted and cartoony, sometimes darker or mildly horror themed, sometimes both. But unlike the Higgins glue tracks thing, the mishmash of ideas never feels scattershot or incohesive. He finds a way to sequence and structure these ideas to feel like they all belong together and complement each other, and the experience is kept very tight and to the point without feeling undercooked. I feel like this might be a good one to recommend for someone looking to get into Venetian Snares for the first time and in need of an indicative starting point to really know what he's all about. It's not my number one favorite album of his, but honestly, it's like top 5 for him. It's great. Though if you wanted to know my number one favorite album of his, yeah, it's still the obvious one. This is his most popular album, already widely considered an all-timer for the whole IDM genre, and chances are, if you only know one project of his, it'll be this one. And it's the only one that, like, really cracked in my regular listening rotation long-term over the past several years. Yeah, I know I ought to have tried harder with some of these others. It's frankly the real primary reason this video exists, but this is still probably the best iteration of the concept of combining classical music with jungle breaks, and I include the Richard D. James album in that. The strings all sound really good, sampling lots of dismal but energetic performances of classical composers like Bartok, Stravinsky, Mahler, Paganini, etc. And, of course, smashing all of the amen breaks on top. Maybe not as, like, all-encompassingly indicative for his overall sound as something like Meathole, but it is one of his most easily accessible albums, and sounds amazing without needing to know any further context. Not that anyone likely needed my recommendation, but you get the idea. Next, this is kind of back to something of a status quo for him, kind of a mix of ideas we've heard from him before, with some acid, a few video gamey influences, some happy hardcore influences as per the title, though still providing roughly as chaotic and scattered the Joker type energy and experience as that title would sort of imply. It is one of his more easily approachable listens, purely on a production and sound palette level. There's nothing super abrasive or off-putting here, at least by his standards. But it's not really one of his more memorable selections of tunes either. Okay, next up, for a bit of a change of pace, here's a self-titled side project he started up under the name Last Step. And rather than the kind of hyperspeed beat work you would expect, this is a fairly straightforward electro and acid house record in a similar vein to, like, Drexcia and Japanese Telecom. I mean, it's nothing super special in the context of this genre. There's more novelty in the fact that Aaron Funk made it than there is in the music itself. If this were, like, Gerald Donald's side alias number 247, it wouldn't have been notable in the same way. But, hey, it's still pretty decent and competently made for what it is, with a couple of solidly catchy moments. A neat curiosity, if not an absolute must-listen. Say, that one album he made with the Hungarian title that combined jungle and classical music was a big success. How about a sequel album with more of the exact same kind of stuff? At least he was nice enough to execute the idea on a roughly comparable level of quality, even letting the instrumentation get even more grandiose with the inclusion of, like, choirs and pianos to join the strings. I think Rossz, Czillag, etc. was more memorable, though that one also benefits a lot from my actually having semi-regularly come back to listen to it, compared to this one, which I just kind of left by the wayside. But perhaps I should be coming back to this one more. There's an easy case for someone to say that this is an improvement on that album's idea. It is a slightly weightier and more imposing listen, and just as easy to recommend. The second Last Step record is probably the best of the three. This shows him bringing in a lot more playful and goofy edges to the electro and acid house mixes, with grooves that all have more bounce and swing to them that puts it in much closer territory to, say, the kind of stuff Mike Paradinas did under his Jake Slazenger alias. I wouldn't call it absolutely essential either, but it is just a solid, low-stakes fun time. This is more of a semi-straightforward, hard-hitting, old-school jungle project, bringing in more, I guess, dub and ragga and hip-hop influences, and reprising a few other ideas from a few different earlier releases. The result is kind of in the same ballpark as that Cavalcade Glee thing, but punchier, tighter, and just all around better across the board. Or I guess in 2018 I likened it to being like the Chocolate Wheelchair album, but a lot less goofy. I guess that works too. In any case, it's very solid, might even be another easy one to point to as a potential starting point for new fans. Now, this one's a lot more specifically focused on hardcore acid bangers. Admittedly, this is one of his more one-note and tuneless affairs. While it's roughly the same length as Detrimentalist, it gave me the feeling it was dragging on a lot more than that one. But hey, I'm always at least a little game for some acid bangers, and he gets these to viscerally hit as well as you'd expect, so yeah, it's nice, but just not a major standout in his catalog for me. Now, this one I initially skipped over in my first attempt to digest his catalog, not because it looked like there was anything overtly edgy or off-putting about it, but because from what I gathered from people's comments, it looked like there wasn't going to be anything here he hadn't already done before, and I was afraid I was going to get burned out on his sound. Now, on one hand, this did deliver pretty much exactly what I thought it was going to, but the good news is that it did not burn me out on his sound. I did like this more than Filth. It's markedly less focused than that one, but doesn't drag or run together like that one kind of did. It's also one of the mildly jokier entrants into his catalog, with goofier sample interjections, and there's two sequels to old tracks of his. One of which, Hajnal 2, delivers exactly what it says on the tin, and the other of which, Aaron 2, is a sequel in name only and barely has anything to do with the track it's supposedly following up. Other than that, as I kind of suspected, it's basically just the status quo of what you would expect from him, neither one of his best nor one of his worst. Next, the third and as of now last Step album is kind of more fairly standard old school electro, kind of like the first Last Step album, but as per the title, falling a bit on the sleepier side. It's alright, I guess. Probably the least interesting of the three albums under this name, but I appreciate the attempt to strip things back this much and go for the sleepier tone against all of his usual instincts. It's not a keeper, but it's not a difficult one to get through. I have definitely heard less interesting stuff in this subgenre before. It's nice. Alright, next we got Classical Strings and Jungle Breaks crossover album number 3, this time with the bonus of prominently featuring Aaron Funk's own singing. As you may surmise, this is a bit of a divisive one with fans, though I didn't really take that much issue with his singing. Again, he's doing a perfectly acceptable David Bowie impression, and covering his voice in like a lot of dub-style echoing. I wouldn't say he's exactly elevating any of these tracks, but he's only a distraction when he's specifically trying to be. I do have to say some of the piss-take moments of this album led to, like, legit the hardest I have ever laughed at anything in his catalog. Most notable example that comes to mind is Your Smiling Face, where he is just doing this serious Bowie-style crooning. I reach up to kiss your smiling face. Whoa! Shout out as well to that one line on the title track. Only you could make my dick feel like this. The dead serious delivery combined with like fucking Beavis and Butthead tier lyrics, that got me. Well played. The only real problem is that it makes for some pretty major tonal whiplash next to, again, the otherwise serious classical crossover style, featuring lots of heavy, grandiose orchestrations in the same lineage as Rossz, Czillag and My Downfall original soundtrack. There's also one track called Shaky Sometimes that gets a little jazzier, brings vibraphones into the mix. That's probably my favorite cut in the bunch. There's even 2 somber and downbeat solo guitar pieces. Very much an album that contains multitudes. Needless to say, it is quite scattered and all over the place and doesn't come together that well as a complete whole, but once again, have to give it props for the biggest standout moments. Next up, at some point in 2015 he found himself in like some kinda tight financial situation, the details which I don't actually know about, but all his fans came in to like pitch in, supporting him through Bandcamp, enough to get him out of that situation, so as a thank you, he posted this album on Bandcamp for Name Your Price. I think this is a collection of unreleased demos and tracks that didn't make the cut for other albums. Not sure, don't quote me on that, my source is one Discogs comment. Although the resulting project, while very all over the place once again, feels at least equally as finished as any of his other mainline albums. I suppose given how fast the guy typically worked, there wouldn't be that much difference between like an unfinished Venetian Snares demo and a finished Venetian Snares track. So yeah, there's a little bit of everything here, some brighter and more melodic stuff, some darker stuff, a lot of straightforward jungle and acid stuff in between. There's some stuff that's really neat, there's some stuff that's kind of more background music filler-ish, and there's also a track called Burger Shot, which has samples from what sounds like an exercise instructor telling people to spread their legs? Okay, hopefully with pants on. Aside from that one skip though, this is yet another project in the category of generally a fun time, if not essential or a keeper. Okay, here's the album whose anniversary inspired me to actually start making this video. Also, I think this might be the single most easily approachable album in his entire catalog. This is a bunch of live modular synth jams. As per the title, this works on the same level as, say, like a Psylob record or something, with a fairly moody, old-school IDM atmosphere, but the approach to the melody and writing and crazy beats in certain moments still have some of the chaotic energy you would expect out of a Venetian Snares release in particular, and feel more easily recognizable as his work specifically than, say, any of the Last Step projects. Everything centered around fairly straightforward synth melodies, and nothing ever gets too unhinged, but never to the point of sacrificing what makes his usual stuff work. I would definitely put this as one of his best projects overall. The new 10th anniversary bonus disc is mostly redundant. Most of it is just slightly alternate takes of the same tracks that already made the original album. But there's a few unreleased cuts that hit as well as everything else here too, and the sound of the original album is well executed enough where listening to 2 rounds of almost the exact same track listing back to back is not a chore to get through, so take that as you will. Next up, here's the one I already did a video on and what is, as of now, his most recent solo studio album. My general feelings and enjoyment level are more or less the same as they were when I did that video, but for those who can't be bothered to go back and see that, this album is basically a cross between what he did on traditional synthesizer music and a huge chrome cylinder box unfolding. It's pure analog synth jamming, although there's no tunes or melodies, and it's almost entirely metallic percussion workouts covered in reverb and dark ambience. It actually runs together a lot more than huge chrome cylinder box. There's pretty much nothing to significantly differentiate any of these tracks apart from each other, though I paradoxically might have still found it an easier listen than that album. I just kinda turned my brain off and sunk myself in the metallic atmosphere, and it worked well on that level, if I digest it like an ambient record. Once again, it's in the tier of solidly enjoyable for what it is, if not a keeper for me. Also notable for featuring quite possibly his best selection of track titles ever. But there's one final album release in his catalog to talk about. I didn't cover this at the time it came out, not just because it's not a solo album and I wasn't doing some stuff I missed roundups yet, but also because it came out literally a few months after he began to cry Tears of Blood, etc., and it looked like a side venture in comparison. And I don't think any of us would have expected this to be the last collection of new music to have the Venetian Snares name on it before he would go on an unofficial, unannounced, indefinite hiatus. But anyway, I guess this is a satisfying enough place to stop anyway, since this is a crossover with none other than Daniel Lanois of all people, who I best know for being a frequent collaborator with Brian Eno. The results are more or less exactly what you would expect combining the styles of these two artists would sound like. Venetian Snares' usual hyperspeed percussion and jungle break workouts, combined with warm and fuzzy ambient guitar drones from Lanois. I have seen the perspective for some people, and by some people I mean Oliver from Deep Cuts, saying that the combination didn't mesh well, as if it were two entirely different unrelated albums playing on top of each other, which I can understand that perspective. I mean, if one were to isolate the two artists' contributions apart from each other, you would in fact get two albums that sound absolutely nothing alike and would probably even be able to stand on their own fine. But I will personally disagree with his assessment and say I think they do in fact add up to something more than just the sum of their parts. Lanois provides the usual Vsnares mix with some emotional tenderness that Funk wouldn't ordinarily deliver on his own, and Funk gives these pleasant drones a level of pulse and excitement they wouldn't have on their own. I'm not going to call it one of my absolute favorite things in the Venetian Snares catalog ever. You can tell that this stuff was mostly composed on the fly and as such kind of meanders wherever without ever having a clear direction or differentiating tracks apart from each other on a meaningful level. But it is a very nice listen, better than the average of what I typically expect out of a given Venetian Snares project. I suppose if Funk were to pull a Daft Punk tomorrow and publicly announce that he doesn't plan to release any more music again, this could theoretically serve as a fitting send-off to his tenure. I'm obviously hoping it's not the last time we ever hear a full album from him, but in any case, this is a really good one all the same. So there we go. That's finally all the thoughts I have on the Venetian Snares album back catalog. Yeah, that was a lot. Big surprise there, but a full discography review on this guy would have been a heck of a lot more exhausting for me to put together. Some of those albums might have been fun for me to discuss in full dedicated video form, but definitely not all of them, and God help me at the idea of having to do an odds and ends on this guy. Hopefully this video will serve as a sufficient enough look at the guy's full career. At the end of the day, he's still got lots of projects I really like or even love, beyond the obvious one I already kept around. I may have to give more time and love to albums like the Chocolate Wheelchair album, Meathole, My Downfall, Detrimentalist, Higgins glue tracks, etc., or traditional synthesizer music. All those feel like keepers to me, and there's loads more I would understand exactly why they would appeal even more to other people than they do to me personally. So there we go, I think I'm going to leave it at that. By the way, as of recording, this t-shirt is still available on the Planet Mew website, though it is a limited edition thing, so who knows how much longer that'll be up. I personally ordered it off the Bandcamp page, and it is not listed there anymore, so yeah. Anyway, in the meantime, I got some more of these catalog and brief things planned, although this was the only artist in my current plans that I've already publicly covered in some form previously. Perhaps the next one will be an artist on the near complete opposite end of the tonal spectrum, but with an equally, if not even more massive back catalog, and also starting with the same letter. But I don't know, we'll see how that goes. In the meantime, of course this is all just my opinion, you can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people, you want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today, see you next time.